Having secured a temporary hideout and home, albeit unconventional, Nettie resided in the crypt, hidden and undisturbed, for almost 2 months.
Well, it was frightening. It was dark, it was very cold, and I was confused. I suppose I was still in denial about my mother having, well, essentially abandoned me. But at the same time, somehow I was stoical. As stoical as she was, really. And I just tried to carry on doing whatever it was I felt I was supposed to be doing.
So there were the toilets that end and also down there. They'd been built for the air raids and one of them still flushed, which was very good fortune. And down here, this is where I set up my little bed. And I stored my food over here, just down in that corner. And then over there, just there, I put all my books. I'd scooped up a big pile of books when I left the house originally, and I set up my little library.
But it was early when I got in, so I managed to set out a bed with a sleeping bag and some blankets, and I lit a few candles, and then I just wrapped the blankets round me as best I could, and the sleeping bag too, even though it was early summer.
With the church out of use, its crypt was essentially abandoned during its closure. Nettie found herself sharing the space with rubbish, junk, and the pipes from the church organ that had also fallen into disrepair.
I was also down there with a load of dead people, although for some reason this never crossed my mind at the time.
Over here is the 2 graves, and I never knew who they belonged to really, but much later on a man told me, a man who came to the church, he said that he assumed, he didn't have any evidence, but he assumed that one of them belonged to the first vicar here and the other one belonged to the architect.
It was in early June that Nettie's forced hermitage began. Initially surviving solely on the food she had taken from her former home, when her supplies began to diminish, she knew that something had to be done, and that she would have to run the risk of being seen.
Well, I'd almost run out of things to eat, and I'd been eating very little anyway, and I was afraid of being spotted or being caught breaking in, so, well, I just never went out during the day. Became a kind of child of the night, as it were. And, well, I always imagined she'd just turn up one day and take me home, and it was all a big mistake, and everything would magically return to normal. So that's how I coped. I suppose I was stoical. Well, that's what she was like. Well, both of them really. Stoical and idealistic. Well, my father died when I was very young, so my own memories of him are pretty limited really. But from what I remember, my mother would say that he was a very loyal man. He was loyal to his family, he was loyal to his job, and he was particularly loyal to the country. He was very patriotic. He was an immensely patriotic person, and this caused all kinds of problems between them because she was fervently opposed to anything like that, smacked of jingoism, and she didn't want anything that would help prop up failing democracy or capitalism and Britain's posturing as some great world power. Well, yeah, I was afraid of getting caught and didn't want to get into any trouble, although I suppose I knew that at some point I would get caught and I wouldn't be able to stay there indefinitely. But above everything else, the thing that really racked me with guilt was the thought that I might have to report my own mother, even though there was nothing I knew that was incriminating of any kind whatsoever. But somehow this was a thing that really upset me. I thought it would seem like just the most unforgivable betrayal. Well, even though it was her who essentially betrayed me. Well, I had the ration book, which had been lying untouched on the living room table. after the ransacking. And I managed to get a good deal of food before I left from the kitchen. I got some loaves of bread and a bit of cheese and some biscuits. And that lasted me actually for a good couple of weeks. And when that ran out, well, I went to the baker, Mr. Stevens, his name was.
Edward Stevens was the proprietor of the popular Stevens Bakery, set in the Gladstone buildings just off the Hampstead Road towards Mornington Crescent. A contemporary and long-standing friend of James and Wendy, Edward was also later linked to the same group of political dissidents, and is thought to have been attendant at the meetings hosted by Wendy.
Yeah, he was a friend of my father's, but well, he was always very dismissive of children, so I knew he'd never ask me anything about my mother or anything like that. When I was an adult, I did try to get back in touch with him, try to contact him, but by then the shop had been taken over and there was no trace of him.
Several years following Wendy's disappearance, Edward Stevens also vanished.
Well, I mean, it's highly likely she's no longer with us. Well, she'll be well into her 90s anyway. I'd been out, I'd gone to get some food. I'm not sure exactly what it was exactly, and then I noticed there was a policeman on the corner of, well, I suppose it'd be Upper Woburn Place. So, well, I was very nonchalant by this time, so I just nipped through the fence and I went over to the crypt and I just climbed up, and I was about to get into the pipe and I was just climbing into it, and all of a sudden I just found myself being dragged back from behind, and in panic I just must have banged my head and blacked out.
Having been finally spotted and apprehended by the police, Nettie awoke to find herself in a cell in Euston Police Station.